Thank you. We've assembled a really dynamic panel of internationally renowned leaders to be part of the discussion this evening. Once again, please welcome Admiral Mike Rogers, the Second Commander of United States Cyber Command and the 17th Director of the National Security Agency. Admiral James Stavridis, former Commander, U.S. European Command and NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe. Admiral Patrick Walsh, the 59th Commander of U.S. Pacific Fleet.
Okay.
And the Honorable Robert Work, the 32nd U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense. Well, gentlemen, good evening.
Good evening.
Okay. Deputy Secretary Work, I'd like to start with the budget, because we just had something happen at the end of last week that seldom happens in Washington, D.C. It's the first time in a decade that there's a budget for a fiscal year and coming in on time. So just explain for folks here tonight what kind of difference that makes to the efficiency at the Defense Department.
I'd just like to say, Catherine, that I'm totally bummed out that I never had the opportunity to have a budget on time. Generally what happens is since 2009, we've spent 30% of the time in what is called a continuing resolution. And that means you are stuck at last year's budget level and last year's authorizations until the new budget is approved. So you have two immediate problems and one macro big problem. First problem is, if the previous year you were spending this much money on readiness, and Secretary Mattis comes in and says, we have to spend a lot more money on readiness. When you start the year in a continuing resolution, you're stuck at this level. And so that causes a major, major problem. The second immediate problem are new starts. Say Mike Rogers comes in and says, I have to have this new cyber tool so that I can improve deterrence against Russian and Chinese cyber. But you can't have any new starts because that was not authorized in the last year. And then at the macro level, when you're in a continuing resolution for 30% of the time, it means you have an 8-month fiscal year. And so you have to spend 12 months worth of money in 8 months. And it is entirely inefficient. And not only that, usually you can't spend it all by the end of the year, and then Congress says you're an idiot because you didn't spend all the money we gave you. So you get a double whammy. So having a budget on the 1st of October is nirvana for the Department of Defense.
So have we effectively been fighting with one hand tied behind our back because of inefficiency in Washington? I know you're all jumping to take that question.
Are you kidding?
The answer is yes.
Right. I mean, it certainly made life harder than it needed to be, certainly harder than I suspect the citizens of our nation would have wanted, because you worked incredibly hard to generate the resources that you expected us to employ in the defense of the nation.
Well, just think of your gas company. You know, 1st of October comes around and your gas bill jumps up by $14 a month. And you say, sorry, I can only pay you what I paid you last year. That's going to cause a problem. It's extraordinarily inefficient. So we have been operating with one hand tied behind our back.
Can I just, however, put this in perspective globally? I mean, we spend $700 billion a year on defense. Russia spends $80 billion. China spends $200 billion. You know, those European freeloaders we keep hearing about spend $300 billion. So over here on Team America is about $1 trillion of defense spending. So taking Bob's point entirely, it's somewhat inefficient. We still bring a lot to the party. And collectively, we spend almost 3 times what Russia and China do combined. And we ought to say thank you to the American public for defending us and providing those kind of resources despite the inefficiencies that Bob correctly points out.
Admiral Walsh, you wanted to come in.
Just to add to the point that Bob was making and Jim, that you got to wonder where the money's going. And in terms of the priorities of the department, the number one cost growth in the department was manpower, followed by readiness, followed by procurement. So oftentimes the characterization of the defense budget is one where we view procurement as the number one item. It's actually paying for the all-volunteer force, which is a study in and of itself in terms of trying to now keep pace with the environment that we're about to describe tonight.
We spend a lot of time in Washington talking about Russia, but I want to actually pivot and look at the Asia-Pacific region. What would you identify as the primary threat to U.S. national security in that region, and why?
In that region, for my point of view, I would start with the South China Sea. And the reason why the South China Sea is so critically important begins with the $5 trillion of economic activity that flows through the Straits of Malacca on the 70,000 container ships that pass through the straits every year. It's hard to distinguish one national interest from another when you look at the global trade that goes through that area. And in light of the revelation by the Chinese in the 2009-2010 timeframe that they consider a historical boundary, what we often refer to as the 9-dash line, subject to internal Chinese law. So when you try and understand the dynamics of what's at place, it's good to understand historically our relationship with the Chinese. We typically try to view China as a nation state and try and rationalize their behavior and predict their outcomes based on them acting like any other nation state in the Westphalian system. China views itself as a civilization. They view the relationship the government has to individuals as advancing the relationship that the civilization has with the rest of the world. My concern in an area that's now has all this center of gravity associated with global economic trade and activity and heightened tensions associated with boundaries and borders and shoals and rocks is that one of miscalculation, where individuals, the warfighters who are out there from their respective nations, are looking through the lens of technology to evaluate the intent of the other guy. To me, in the environment that we're in today is not the environment we were in 27 years ago when we could escalate or de-escalate tension at the time and place of our own choosing. It's a very different world today in terms of the capabilities of the people who are occupying those regions. And I think it was, very important for us to look at what we heard about NDUF today as a way to remind ourselves that the people who are out there need to be thinking critically, need to be savvy on their feet, and they need to the best degree possible, allow national leadership to make decisions on escalating and de-escalating when their own lives are at risk on the, out in the region.
You know, could I just add a thought, which is to pick up both Secretary Work and Admiral Walsh, is in the Pentagon, we get very excited when we have a 5-year plan. You know, we're doing high fives. We figured it out, what's going to happen in 2023. In Beijing, they're sitting thinking, what's the 200-year future of China? And this gets to the South China Sea, because China's suite of cards is missing one thing: hydrocarbons. And the South China Sea, in addition to all the trade that Pat talked about, has got billions of barrels of oil and trillions of cubic feet of gas. That's why they want that to be a territorial sea. That's a 100-year plan, 200-year plan. As Secretary Work was telling me before we came in here, we need to get a lot better at pushing out our strategic planning if we're going to succeed in this monumental competition with China.
And if I could just pivot off what Admiral Stavridis said, you know, the other huge advantage we have here are our friends and alliances. You cannot, you know, our values, our friends and alliances, and I would argue our economy and what that enables us, that is our strength. That's what enables us, to give us these options that we have tried to use in the course of our careers. And it's one area, I don't care if it's the Russians, I don't care if it's the Chinese, the North Koreans, they do not have friends, they do not have allies. We need to continue to focus on that because it is a huge competitive advantage for us, and it helps negate some of the capabilities and advantages of these nations that are problematic or competitors for us.
Well, in the past, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, the United States has never faced a strategic competitor like China. They have an enormous population, an enormous manufacturing capability, and there was a very, very good article today on the opinion page of the Washington Post by Sebastian Mallerby. And he said, look, the United States is shooting at the wrong target here in this competition. We seem to believe that the Chinese are nothing more than a country that steals our IP and copies it. He says, that is well beyond. If all we do is stop them, he says, if we stopped totally Chinese theft of our IP, we'd still be in a technological race that unlike ever we've seen. Quantum computing, 5G, artificial intelligence. The Chinese have a national plan to bury the United States by 2030 in all of these technologies. And it's less and less about IP theft now, and it's more and more about their own technological ecosystem that is really going to give us a run for our money.
So here is not exactly the good news, but again, agreeing completely with Bob, China's road looks very smooth right now. I think in the 10-year future, it starts to get bumpy for a variety of reasons. One is demographics. They will continue to age as a society. Second, they have a $1 trillion remediation bill on their environment. Third, they have a superheated real estate, commercial environment they have to deal with. And also, and we can argue whether this is advantage or disadvantage, but they're not a democracy. You can't lift the safety valve of political intent and change the government. So, yes, we have a serious competitor out there. They've got some challenges and flaws ahead as well. They're not 10 feet tall. What matters, and I know Secretary Work would agree, is how we lay out the strategic track to compete with them going forward.
Admiral Rogers, are there red lines that the Chinese are willing to cross with technology that we are not, that give them an advantage?
So, one of the things, and Secretary Work and I have talked about this, so what are the implications of technology in the digital age for a nation's security? It's an area that I don't think we as a nation have spent enough time thinking about, and about the second and third order effects. You saw that coincidentally just play out in Australia for the last few months, where the Australians just developed a national policy about how 5G technology was going to be implemented in Australia, and they made a decision for economic competitiveness and for national security that they wanted to restrict certain foreign companies, in this case, read Huawei and ZTE, from being able to build the foundational backbone for 5G in Australia. I think that is, I'm not going to talk about the specifics of the decision, but stepping back as a nation and asking yourself, so what does this mean? You already heard Secretary Work. You look at the Chinese, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, nanotechnologies. They have clearly picked a handful of technologies that they believe will offer the nation of the 21st century a competitive advantage. I compliment them. They have stepped back and they have looked at this from a strategic perspective and then said, so what do we have to make, what do we got to do to invest? How do we align the academic world, the private sector, our military, and our espionage and other efforts? How do we align all that in a coherent strategy designed to achieve advantage in these areas? It's one reasons why, for example, data now is a value all of its own. It's not by coincidence you see these huge investments in artificial and machine learning, and then you see, for example, massive data thefts, 28 million records in OPM. If you look at some of insurance information, watching the data that's being extracted out of there, this is all part of a broader strategy. So to get to the answer to your question, I think the challenge for us as a nation is, how do we bring together the private sector and the government in a coherent strategic vision about how we're going to deal with this technology and its implications for a nation's security, both its economic competitiveness as well as its own defense. And we're just not where we need to be right now, I would argue.
You know, I think we've talked a lot about the technology as though that's the key thing. The other aspect of this is political, geostrategic, as in geographic. And it is what they call the One Belt, One Road, sometimes referred to as the New Silk Road. This is the idea that China will control the South China Sea, Pat's Point. They will then flow through the Strait of Malacca into the Indian Ocean, move toward Africa, one fork, Arabian Peninsula, Europe, another fork. It's a geographic flow that moves Chinese goods out, moves raw materials in, it overlays with the technology. We need to be smart about how to deal with that. And I want to make a second point about China, which is it's a great plan. They've got the technology moving, the geography works, but what is parked right in the middle of the One Belt, One Road? It's this nation called India that we don't talk about enough, that is a democracy that will surpass China in its population within the next decade, that has many flaws and many challenges. Its road is bumpy now. Its road smooths out in the future. How we relate to India will be an extraordinarily important counterweight to our relationship with China.
Bob, I think you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, these points are really, really fundamental to the United States. You look back in the Cold War, and we did well long-range strategic planning. We set the country up for a long-term strategic competition with the Soviet Union. And in the end, we prevailed through a wide variety of different leaders and different administrations, both Republican and Democratic. For the last 25 years, we have not had to do grand strategy. We have essentially had a preponderance of hard power, both economic and military, and we've only been faced with regional competitors. So strategically, I would argue, and Secretary Mattis makes this comment explicitly, our strategic muscles have atrophied. So Jim's point is exactly right. For us to compete with China that has an extremely long view of the world, we have to get back to grand strategy and figure out how to best compete geopolitically, geoeconomically, and technologically. And this is really, really important because the Chinese have a theory called civil-military fusion. If you talk with Andrew Ng, who was the former CEO of Baidu, he said, look, if Baidu came up with a problem on artificial intelligence or machine learning, we'd call the central government and they'd come down with a SWAT team to help us. Vice versa, if the government ran into a problem, they'd call Baidu and say, okay, come on, and they'd do it. Meanwhile, Google pulls out of Maven, Project Maven, which was nothing more than machine learning and computer vision. That was it. And meanwhile, Google is going to China, where everything they do in China, every single thing they do in China, will go directly to the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. So I'm not saying that we need to duplicate the Chinese civil-military fusion. I don't think that would work in the United States. But we need to come up with a theory of competition which blends the strengths of our commercial sector and our government sector so we compete over time.
Admiral, yeah.
So watch where the money goes. So take the money and you marry that to a concept of operations and you get a strategy. During the Cold War, we had across the range of military operations from counterinsurgency all the way to thermonuclear, we had what we call general purpose forces that would swing from one contingency to the next. That's the force that essentially fought Desert Storm. What happens on 9/11 is the demonstration of what happens when you lower the barrier to entry, when 19 individuals have strategic impact to the nation. You introduce now the world of cyber, and you've lowered that barrier to entry into national security, corporate security, and personal security matters. And when you're dealing with a threat profile that is that ubiquitous, you have to ask the question, are we organized for this? Are we organized on the Hill in terms of committee structure? Are we organized in the department in order to deal with what all the speakers are saying is you're not leveraging what the private sector has. We're falling back in traditional sorts of ways that we would approach both DOD and DHS. And until you figure out how to unlock and bring together all that capability, then you're not keeping pace with the environment that is leaving you behind.
Yeah, just to pick up on Pat's excellent point. Think about the Cabinet of the United States, cabinet officers and agencies. We are perfectly optimized for the 19th century. We have a Department of Agriculture, really? I mean, 6% of the US workforce is focused on agriculture. We have a Department of the Interior which manages national parks and Indian reservations. Yet we have nobody, Pat's point, who is focused on cyber. Where's our Secretary of Cyber? That's the backbone of our economy in every sense of the
Would that
word.
be your recommendation to the current
It
administration?
would, and I'll tell you exactly how I'd do it. I would take the Director of National Intelligence, who is a cabinet-level official, and I would make him or her the Director of National Intelligence and Cybersecurity. It's a sort of a starter way to at least get it at the table. Because right now, the senior cyber is kind of DHS, but they've got 18 agencies they're focused on. It's filtered through the Secretary of Defense via the NSA director, which we have one each right here, and somewhat through Commander Cyber Command. But when the president sits down at his table to talk about cyber, which I would argue is the greatest extant threat to our way of life, full stop, if someone really took it apart, because our electric grid runs off it, our transportation, our personal lives. Think about what that supercomputer you're carrying around in your pocket says about you. Vulnerable. But there's nobody at the table to advise the president. But don't worry, he's got a Secretary of the Agriculture right there. And by the way, he's got a Secretary of the Interior who 2 days ago opined about how we need to blockade Russia. Go figure that one out. We need a new structure in the
So
cabinet.
Jim, notice what we're not talking about. 5 years ago, we'd be talking about the global war on terror, or we'd be talking about Taiwan. Taiwan's completely eclipsed from the conversation, at least at the national level. So you look at where we are today, and you got to ask yourself, are we positioned for the environment that really recognizes the digital ecosystem that we're in? Or are we just trying to catch up with an old model and fit it into a new environment? Because we haven't been creative enough. I think we're probably missing out on the youth of the country. I think we're missing out on the role that commercial threat intelligence could play in the curriculum at NDU. I think there's ways that the NDU and the NDU Foundation can lead this discussion that would be really interesting, creative, and operational.
Admiral Rogers.
There's a guy to live this every day. So I don't disagree. One of my, and Secretary Work, remember this, I would say this at times, the challenge is we have finite capacity and it is way too disparately spread across this thing we call the federal government. From a military perspective, we would never develop a structure like this. It is so widely dispersed. There's not enough expertise, there's not enough people. So one of the things when I said, hey, we need to think about what are the implications for technology and our national security, it's more than just the technology. What about our structures, our processes? What do we prioritize? What are we investing in? How are we developing the human capital of the future? One of the things I said as I've been saying it for a while, but this was a particular topic as I was leaving, was we have got to acknowledge the current structure has not generated the outcomes that we want. So sticking with this structure, I'm scratching my head going, so what leads us to believe it is going to generate something different? There's an opportunity here. But what we need to do, as you've heard from others, is step back and ask ourselves, how do we align this capability into a coherent structure that develops results, has accountability? I would go to my DHS counterpart and say, what kind of access do you have to your secretary? I go, for me, I just pick up the phone, the red switch, I get the DepSecDep, I get to the secretary, I could go to the National Security Advisor if I need to in our structure. For others, I'm going, you got to go through 5 or 10 layers. You don't get any timeliness. You're dissipating your capability. I just think we have got to step back and ask ourselves, to the points you previously heard, what does the 21st century look like? Because we're using structures right now that are industrial age, that to me reflect a whole different world. And in this new world that we're finding in, this huge interconnectivity, which means now we have shared global vulnerabilities at a level we just didn't have before. The same old thing isn't going to work. And that's one thing where you, as private individuals, I think are a huge part of the solution going forward. The government cannot do this by itself. You
Yeah.
look at the election process that we just went through. One of the things I would say when we were in this process was, I understand the structure we created. In our legal system, states and local entities execute elections that determine not only state and local outcomes, but we also use to generate a national outcome in the form of president, for example. Can you tell me how a county is supposed to withstand the focused efforts of a Russia or a China in the world that we're living in today? This is just crazy.
So this is how you get companies wanting to hack back.
Right.
Is because the whole deterrence model as we understood it growing up and how it applied at the nation state level doesn't seem to work. So what's the deterrent to a North Korea from attacking Sony?
I mean, I think it's some of the changes in policy. I will say I was not particularly a big proponent of the hackback. I believe there's a role for the private sector, but the analogy I used to use was, guys, the cyber world is like the wild, wild west. And at times within the DoD arena, I felt I was the sheriff on the street trying to clear it all. And the analogy I used was, look, I don't need more people with 6-shooters wandering out in the street and shooting. I'm not sure this is going to get us where we need to do. We got to do this in a more structured way, but I do acknowledge we got to figure out how can you bring the private sector.
Well, it comes down to the relationship with government. I mean, companies are asking, what can I expect from government if I'm the one that's under attack? And we would take your talking points. We would take your talking points and we would run with that because
That's how close we are.
because in the world of cyber, it doesn't escalate in a linear way. So just because a company hacks back doesn't mean necessarily that the adversary is going to be content to deal with that company. He'll go to the ATM machine. He'll go to the grid. I mean, there's all kinds of different ways that he can put pressure on us.
You know, an image you can use when you think about this is an iceberg. So what the government does in the end is kind of the tip of the iceberg. The mass of the iceberg is the private sector. And that's to the point others have made here that what NDU brings is the ability to bring private sector together with public and have the conversation. Another way to think of it is we are on the beach at Kitty Hawk thinking about this in aviation terms. We're just beginning. We're trying to figure out ICAO routes and airports and what language controllers are going to use. But the problem is moving at speed, and we don't have decades to figure that out the way we did in aviation, or centuries like we did on the oceans. We've got to figure out the cyber world like now, now, now. That's why, to Mike's point, there's a balance between what the private sector wants to do, but there's got to be a government imprimatur over it.
On this, Catherine,
go
too.
ahead.
You know, in the early part of the Cold War, when everyone was going after nuclear weapons, and everyone started to thinking about strategic deterrence theory and mutual assured destruction, there were two different ways to think about how you would utilize your nuclear weapons. One was called counter-value targeting, and counter-value targeting was threatening the population or the society of your adversary with destruction. So you'd have these big, giant, megaton range bombs. They weren't very accurate, but it were close enough for government work. And you would threaten annihilating cities, and that underlined mutual assured destruction. Then there was counter-force targeting, and counter-force targeting looks at the means, the military generation capability of your adversary and their nuclear forces. The United States was really good at counter-value targeting. I mean, we made no bones about it. But over the course of the Cold War, we became more and more and more focused on counter-force targeting. And since the end of the Cold War, with our move to precision conventional munitions, we are now very counter-force. I mean, we don't want to cause a single collateral casualty. And this gets to cyber. Our adversaries think of cyber as a counter-value weapon, a weapon to unhinge our society, to go after our ATM machines, to go after our financial networks, to go after our transportation networks, all of what Jim said. We still think of cyber, I would argue, as primarily a counter-force weapon used in a very discrete manner against militaries. We simply wouldn't do to Russia what they're doing to us. We wouldn't do it because of our democratic norms. And that's what Jim's point is. We have got to think about deterrence in the cyber era in a new way. And I agree, whether you call it 1920 in the interwar period or on the beach at Kitty Hawk, we're way, way behind and got a lot of work to do.
Admiral Rogers, I just want to ask you, would you support a cyber secretary at a cabinet level?
So clearly, we got to bring this all together in one way. They got to have accountability, they got to have access to resources, and they got to have access to senior decision makers that will enable timely outcomes. Now, there's lots of different strategies about how you might do it. I would like to see a couple models and us really bore into this. But the key takeaway to me is doing more of the same is not going to generate different outcomes. And we have got to do something different.
If I just stay with you on one other issue, President Trump said
So I got
recently,
that going for me.
President Trump said recently that there was evidence that China was interfering in the electoral process. I know you've been out of the NSA for a few months, but was there evidence of that on your watch? And if so, what does it look like?
So I'll just use 2016 because we talked about a lot, both the Russian piece as well as the Chinese. What we saw from the Chinese was they clearly were paying attention to our election process. They were using cyber and other things as a tool, but their focus seemed to be trying to understand parties' positions, potential implications for China. Hey, if party X were to win, what would their policies be vis-a-vis China? It did not appear to us as if trying to affect outcomes, change the tenor of the discussion. We just didn't see that. I'm not there now. Don't get me wrong, we continue to see foreign states who are very interested in our election outcomes. It's just interesting, you look at, it kind of goes to some of the things we talked about. The Russians view cyber as a tool to achieve a strategic effect. It wasn't about stealing intellectual property. It wasn't about gaining knowledge and insight as much as how do I hold at risk things that the Americans value? How do I use cyber as a tool to achieve a strategic outcome? The whole reason they were focused on the election, for example, was how do I undermine America and its democratic institutions? How could I potentially shape an outcome to achieve an election victory with someone who is better aligned with what I think is going to generate positive outcomes for me, Russia? China, on the other hand, cyber is a tool to negate advantage that the Americans and the others have. Steal intellectual property. Understand operational advantage that the American military has. How can we use cyber as a military tool to negate some of that advantage? The Russians, high end, I would always say, hey, they are really good. China, they're working their way there. They're not quite there yet. They tended to use a very industrial age model initially. When you've got 1.3 billion people, you tend to throw in human capital at the problem, and you saw them do it in spades early on, but you're watching them evolve. And as to go to Secretary Work's point, we have got to evolve with it. Because the dynamic we're in now, we're on the wrong end of the cost equation, and many of you, both as individuals and in companies, you are living with this every day.
So we talked a moment ago about a cabinet level position on cyber, which I do advocate for. The other thing I believe we ought to be doing, and Admiral Rogers and I have had this conversation for, it feels like a decade. I think we should have a cyber force, as in we have an Army, a Navy, a Marine Corps, an Air Force. We're missing a cyber force. And if you go back 100 years ago, we had an Army, a Navy, and a Marine Corps. We didn't have an Air Force 100 years ago. Why? Because we were barely starting to fly airplanes. When historians look back 100 years from now at this period and they say they had an Army, a Navy, a Marine Corps, and an Air Force, but they didn't have a cyber force,
We're going to get a Space Force.
we will be found wanting. And by the way, I agree, and I think you can make a case for space and cyber potentially together, but I think much more important than a Space Force is a cyber force. Not big, 5,000, 10,000. Mike's looked at this in great depth, and he will tell you, we can sort of have a pickup team from each of the services, put them together under Cyber Command, it works. I would argue we need a dedicated force, just like we need a dedicated force of naval professionals who drive ships, and we need a dedicated Army and Marine Corps. I think we need a cyber force.
At what point or what size does an attack have to approach in order to warrant a kinetic response? Just at the end of last week, we had confirmation that 50 million accounts on Facebook may have been compromised.
Maybe 100 million.
100 million.
And I think the way to think of this is a spectrum that runs from a kind of a nuisance interference in cyber to a intrusion and espionage to a manipulation of data to an implantment of long-term capability to destruction of data to activity that causes real kinetic effect of some kind, kills people and breaks things. Where on that spectrum do you define a cyber attack? I'd argue it's over at this end where there is a kinetic effect in the real world. It's somewhere between destruction of massive amounts of data and real kinetic effect, destroying a dam, destroying the ability to land airplanes on time, causing death. I think that's where a cyber attack is. And this is important, for example, in a NATO context, where an attack on one is an attack on all. You have to define it. We've not figured that out yet.
Yeah, I have to admit, it was a spectrum. And Secretary Worker, remember, this really came to a head for us November 2014, Sony. Destructive attack by North Korea. Cost the Sony Corporation about $300 million. Slicks all the desktops and laptops, and because they use an integrated phone and cyber capability, took out their phone communications. And we were having discussions from a policy perspective. Have we tripped the threshold here? Because if the same effect had been achieved by a TLAM missile, for example,
right,
we would be arguing act of war. Ultimately, in this case, the policy decision was made. We're going to call it destruction of property, theft of intellectual property. That is violation of U.S. law. We're going to treat this as a law enforcement issue. Therefore, DOD, you're part of this, but you're not going to be the primary response. We're clearly still working our way through this. But I think one of the challenges we got to deal with, we have got to figure out how we communicate this to the outside world. Because quite frankly, in the absence of a sense of what is going to trip a threshold, the outside world, the Russians, the Chinese, others, they will keep pushing the threshold until they believe they've somehow reached something that is going to generate a response. Put another way, and I said this in the last PC I ever attended, think about, we have gotten to the situation where the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, and the North Koreans view cyber as a capability that offers low-risk options to leadership. And yet we as a nation have come to the conclusion that cyber is high risk for our nation in terms of options. I just felt, guys, we have gotten totally disconnected here. And we have managed through, I understand the why, and I was part of that, but the logic has put us in a situation where we are incredibly disadvantaged, and it is encouraging others to engage in behavior that I don't think is in our best interest.
I totally agree with that. And if you go to this Sony hack, just to get everyone on the same sheet of music, Sony Pictures makes a film called The Interview. It's a terrible movie, don't watch it. But it mocks the young leader of North Korea. So North Korea unleashes a cyber attack against Sony, an American corporation, as Mike says, does $300 million worth of kinetic damage. Your question, Catherine, what constitutes an attack? Let me give you a comparative. If North Korea had sunk a Carnival cruise liner, say an empty one that had been constructed in North Korea, those things cost about $100 million. If they decided to sink that, how would we have regarded that? It would be an attack. And I frankly fault the Obama administration, not Admiral Rogers, but Obama administration, for not responding more sharply to that. And I think that's your point. That was an attack, and we leaned back from that, and I think made a mistake because we failed to exercise the possibility of creating real deterrence in the cyber world.
So what does an offensive cyber strategy look like for the Trump administration?
Well, I think you're seeing that play out. The administration has announced a change to the policy document that used to govern many of the cyber operations that the government was doing in the form of Presidential Policy Directive 20. That has been revised. You heard the National Security Advisor within the last 2 weeks talk about a belief that we need to be willing to consider a broader range of options, that we want to communicate to other nations that this continued level of activity is something that we are prepared to respond to, that we are unhappy with what the courses of actions we have pursued to date, and therefore we acknowledge we're going to have to do something different. Now the meat is being put on the bone about what does that mean, what is DHS's role going to be, what's the DOD role, what is law enforcement going to do in all this. It is broadly moving in the right direction. If you last, and I've been was a part of both teams, we have done legal indictments, we have done economic sanctions, we have done public outings of Russian and Chinese activity in particular, but a couple other nations as
And
well.
Iranians.
And Iranian, both US, but also coalition, US, Great Britain, France, Germany, Australia, others. So you can tell that the pendulum is shifting to this idea of we got to be willing to be more public, more upfront, faster in the way we react. So I'm hoping the trends are moving in the right direction. We're going to have to give this some time, though, to see if the new.
But I'd like to say, as a member of the Obama administration, this was a subject of heated debate throughout. And I agree with Jim. President Obama's administration viewed the use of cyber almost like the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. That if you used it, you would inevitably start up the escalatory ladder. And the United States has a much broader cyber attack surface than any other nation in the world, with the possible exception of China. And that it was a disproportionate escalatory dynamic. And they said, okay, we can't even use it to attack ISIS. So Secretary Carter would come in and say, I want to drop cyber bombs on ISIS. And it took us 6 months to finally give Mike the authority to develop the tools to actually use that. And I would say that by the end of the Obama administration, they were saying, look, this is an extremely escalatory regime on the cyber side. We have to be very careful. But the ground was moving under their feet. And it's not that they weren't debating this. They were debating it all the time. Mike was in the middle of it. He'd be called to the National Security Advisor all the time. But it was not an easy thing. And to your point, Catherine, how would we respond? Would we go after Rosoboron export? Would the United States go in and do a kinetic cyber attack on Rosoboron export in retaliation to an attack on Sony? Well, you really have to start thinking about what's going to happen, because it really could get ugly really fast. So it's not an easy, this isn't black or white.
Right.
Yeah,
And we did
although
on
I
the
was,
thing.
go ahead. Well, I was going to say about President Obama, for whom I have great respect, and I worked for him directly as a combatant commander for over 5 years. Sometimes our greatest strength can become our greatest weakness. And President Obama is very measured, he's very careful, listens to all the arguments. I would argue in this particular instance, a more aggressive posture would have made more sense.
He was risk averse.
He was very risk averse.
Admiral Walsh, this sort of brings us back to your theme of miscalculation. If China sort of runs the spectrum between being a competitor to an adversary, how do we get them to take a more constructive role in the region to bring stability to the Korean Peninsula?
I think what we've been guilty of in the past is assuming that if we are closer to China, they'll be more like us. And I just don't think that's the case. I don't think the history bears that out. I think we had opportunities at Versailles in order to reconcile some of the real differences that China had with the rest of the world. And shortly after those decisions at Versailles, Shandong province was given to the Japanese, and China was never whole. And you can see on the calendar when the birth of the Chinese Communist Party follows right after that. So you think about now what it takes in order to deal with a country that is, in its own view, dealing with a century and a half of shame. And that's their united front as both a government and a people to restore the name of China. I look at this through Chinese game theory, which is Go. So instead of playing checkers or chess, the idea is to lay out all the stones and to put pressure on you from as many different angles as they can. And then you'll come to the realization that your life will get better only if you yield. So we've been playing this sort of game theory out in Asia Pacific for the last few years. And I think I'd like to give credit to the administration reaching out direct to North Koreans, because the Chinese have brought us to where we are on the peninsula, and that's a very unsatisfying solution, far be it a solution. But I do think that overtures directly to the North Korean regime are probably in order at this point.
We just have a few minutes left, and we're just 5 weeks away from the midterm elections. And Admiral Rogers,
It's good to be in Chicago.
Yes. You know, Admiral Rogers, I'm interested to know whether you have the same confidence in the ICA, which was the intelligence community's assessment about Russian interference, now that you did back in January 2017.
I do. I have stated so publicly. I said that to President Trump. I said it to President Obama. I've said it to congressional testimony. As an intelligence professional, I thought it is one of the best things I was ever affiliated with. I thought it managed to bring together the range of insights and opinions within the intelligence community to help our nation identify activity and what its strategic implications were. I like the fact that in the report, for example, you saw 3 key judgments. One of the 3 had a difference of opinion. NSA, I was at a lower confidence level than my other counterparts. I thought that was a strength. My comment to the Director of National Intelligence in the time, this should highlight to our citizens the value of a spectrum of opinion, that we are willing to do that and not just try to throw everything together. I thought that, it was a real positive. Bottom line, nothing I have seen leads me to change the report. The challenge, I think, having said that, is we have spent so much time focused on whether or not this actually happened. My argument would be, guys, that's not the core issue. The core issue is, so tell me, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to make sure this doesn't happen again? Because we got a nation state out there that not only was using cyber information and other tools to potentially shape outcomes, but was attempting to use fissures, issues, differences within our nation against us at a level that we just haven't, not that we haven't seen that kind of activity before, but they just took it to another level. Race, religion, the things that are fundamental to us as a society and our beliefs in openness, differences of opinion. We've become this incredibly polarized society. And you're watching the Russians try to take advantage of that and turn it against us. That is not in our best interest. That is totally unacceptable to me. And we ought to be sending a very strong signal. We're aware of this activity. We're going to work hard to stop it, and we're going to hold you accountable if you continue this. And if you want a relationship with us, and there are many important areas where we could be very cooperative with the Russians to achieve strategic outcomes that benefit both our nations and the broader world we're a part of. But you can't have that kind of issue
Let me
without some-
agree entirely with Mike that we ought to criticize Russia. What's the real problem here? It's the polarization in our own society. It is the way we are driven to the extremes. It is the gridlock in our society.
But let me
finish.
Yeah.
We have created these vulnerabilities. We ought to look in that mirror and say, what do we need to do as a society to move ourselves away from these violent extremes which are driving us and creating this vulnerability that Mike says correctly Russia is exploiting? What can we do to get our society, our thinking, our way of life back toward the center where we can agree with each other and get out of these echo chambers on either side? To me, that's the uber issue, which is above and beyond our concern with Russia's interference.
My question is, are the divisions that we are seeing today the fruits of this Russian operation in 2016?
No.
They were there
They
well
are
before
part
us.
of and parcel of a wide variety of issues that have emerged in American society. And we also want to keep it in perspective. We've had other major divisions in our national life, including a civil war that kills a third of the adult male population of this country in the 1860s. But today, we need to aggressively move against the politics of polarization and division and move ourselves back toward the center, where I would argue 60% of the American people live. If we can do that, Russia becomes white noise off on a side.
And it's very important, you know, we call these cyber attacks. It's not the right way to talk about it. These are societal and governance cohesion attacks. They are strategic attacks against a democracy. If we fought the Cold War to make the world safe for democracy, Russia and China want to make the world safe for authoritarianism. And they do that by weakening democratic nations however they can. And so they go after fissures, and they widen them and deepen them. And so we ought to call them what they are. We are under strategic attack. Cyber is just used to achieve the effect.
It's a tool. It's a tool.
And so it is important that we really, in my view, throw more sanctions onto the Russians and contest them at every single spot, because this really is something that we're allowing them to do. It doesn't matter. Putin came out and said, I would have preferred Trump to win. But he didn't care, because he accomplished his strategic effect regardless of who would have become the president of the United States. He would have caused these societal and cohesion problems, which I agree, Catherine, are exploiting fissures that are already in our society.
What are you expecting in 5 weeks from the Russians?
I'm not going to get into public speculation about what could.
But you have so much experience.
Could or not be. We'll work our way through this. We've got to be a resilient society. We're in a new digital age, and we got to ask ourselves, what does that mean for us as a society? We've got to be more resilient internally.
Aren't the Russians really playing in this battle space, though, because so many factors really are going against them in the long term? Demographics are going against them, economy is going against them, natural resources are going against them. So playing in this space is a reflection of the disadvantages.
It is. Another way to put this is Vladimir Putin is an excellent tactician. He kind of turns inside us. He's creative, he's relentless, he has brilliant individual schemes. He'll go after and kill an individual agent to send a signal to the intelligence world. Great tactician. He's a terrible strategist. He's driving Russia away from the West, and Russia's future is with Europe. It's with the West. China, with whom Vladimir Putin is playing footsie these days, big war games, embracing them. China looks at Eastern Russia, at Siberia, the way my dog looks at a ribeye steak. It looks really tasty. And Vladimir Putin is playing with fire in that regard. He's making a strategic miscalculation. At the end of the day, your point, we ought to worry more about Russian weakness than Russian strength.
Yeah, I mean, this is really critical. If you think, the United States remains the single most predominant nation on Earth. China is still below us in certain measures of national power. They're catching up, especially in economic power. But they are following what they refer to as a leap-ahead strategy, a leapfrog strategy. They are going to try to leapfrog over the United States primarily through economic and technological innovation. The Russians are way down here, and they know that they will never be able to jump above the United States. The only way they can compete is to bring the United States comparatively closer to them through their level by weakening our democracy. So this gets back to Jim's original point. This is about strategy. This is about grand strategy and competing against two great powers at the same time. We only had to compete against one in the Cold War, at least up until about 1982. And then, my money is on the United States. I think it was Steve Hadley who says the Chinese have a great hand, they're playing it well. The Russians have a terrible hand, they're playing it well. The United States has the best hand, and we aren't playing. So, like I said, somebody asked me, hey, how do you sleep at night? And I say, I sleep like a baby. I wake up crying every 2 hours. But once we compete, once the United States competes, my money's on the United States. So I always go back to sleep.
Yeah, let me just add a cautiously optimistic note, because we've spoken a lot about threat and challenge tonight, and I completely agree. My money is on democracy, not just on the United States. It's on the idea of democracy, on freedom of speech, on liberty, on gender equality, racial equality. Look, we execute all those values imperfectly, but they are the right values. And the long throw of human history, from when we crawled out of caves to started to form villages, to created individual regions, to created nation states, the long throw of human history is on democracy and those values, because human nature abhors a boss, and because human nature gravitates over time toward the light. And we are in a period now, maybe like we were in the 30s, when there's a flirtation with authoritarianism, fascism. My money is on democracy, on those value sets. We can get there. We need to get out of the extremes and drive from the center. We get to the light.
Well, just to close out the discussion, how does NDU or the NDU Foundation sort of touch some of these issues to find a strategic resolution?
Well, I think you're describing a world that's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And when I think of the NDU model, oftentimes we try and measure success by how many students we push into the classroom. Rarely do we sit back and actually look at what those students are doing in contribution. The example that comes to mind to me was on March 11th, 2011. And for those who were in Hawaii with me, we were looking at seismograph data that looked like there was a problem with the technology, because anything over an 8.3 magnitude earthquake in Japan is a 1,000-year event. We were looking at 9.1. And because Japan is the most instrumented country in the world, we have a better idea today of what happened and where and when. But after 300 years, the Eurasian plate and the Pacific plate, who had been pushing up against each other for all these years, released energy 65 miles off the coast of Sendai. It displaced 21,500 feet of water at its depth, which equated to about 10 billion tons of water. That's moving at the speed of a jet that hits the coastline. And when it does, it creates a wave 133 feet high, reaches 6.5 miles inland, and like an egg beater sort of pulls everything out to sea. And it knocks out primary, secondary, and tertiary power to Fukushima power plant. We were contemplating the evacuation of Japan at that point. And what's interesting in the connection is that we realized when we arrived in this unprogrammed, unscripted, unprepared environment, that the greatest asset that we had for us is an all-volunteer force that since 1986 and Goldwater-Nichols legislation required those career officers who were going to stay in the force to have professional military education. Meaning, if you look at the higher education model, it's exactly what we needed. The higher ed model that I'm thinking of is when, at the master's level, individuals comb the academic landscape. They look at the landscape of ideas. They find their own ideas, and they plant their flag. And through the exercise, have to form an argument, collecting primary and secondary evidence to support their arguments, and then defend those arguments in front of those peers. And by design, it's counterintuitive. No one ever wrote a dissertation that said the status quo was fine. The whole idea of the academic exercise is to stand alone and to present your ideas in a cogent fashion across the landscape and the audience, who are your peers, whose opinions really do matter. The people who landed as part of that force that arrived in support of Operation Tomodachi, which means friend, is a group of people that had this discipline, whether it be in professional military education, as military strategists, or as engineers, or as lawyers, or as career operators who had gone off to civilian institutions. but they went through the same exercise. That exercise holds up under duress. That exercise now creates an environment where there are no solutions. And you have to, on your own, come up and figure out how do you move forward as a force. So the group that I was with are predominantly graduates from this institution and the foundation that supports it. And when we walked into Japan on March 12th, 2011, the approval rating for the United States Armed Forces was around 33, 34%. When we left, it was in excess of 91%. And that's because, in the words of the Japanese, you saw our house in a mess. You came in the back door, you rearranged all the furniture, put it back in its place, and then you left the door that you came from without calling attention to yourself. That's your professional military education. That's the ethics and the virtues that have been described here by speakers on the stage. That's put in operation. So to me, when I evaluate the contribution that NDU and the foundation make to not only armed forces, but to the world around us, is there a force multiplier that's never really been analyzed and assessed in a way that describes the real return on the investment that the American people have made. It's one that I'm really proud of.
Can I make one personal comment?
Of course.
I had a very traditional naval career until I went to National War College. I spent 22 years figuring out how to achieve maritime dominance at sea. I felt really good about my ability to do that. All tactical, all about how do I defeat an opponent at sea. And then I got to National War College at the NDU, and I started thinking to myself, Rogers, that's great, but that is not enough in this profession we call the United States Navy and the broader Department of Defense. I got exposed to people from across the US government. I got exposed to foreign counterparts. I got exposed to intelligence professionals. I got exposed to State Department and others. And it really started me thinking. The first time I ever met Pat Walsh, he comes to talk to my class at NDU, and I'm thinking to myself, God, is this guy good? I graduate from NDU, I go to the Pentagon. I'm blessed to get to the mentorship of a guy like Jim Stavridis. I get to work with a Bob Work. And General Peter Pace, who's here, the 16th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the first Marine ever to be a chairman, he hires me and starts me on this path that leads me to be sitting here today as a four-star. That would have never happened for me if it hadn't been for great people and great institutions like NDU. And that is the power of an institution to me. It's about bringing people together to help achieve outcomes and to grow. And that institution takes help, nurturing, and leadership. And all of you, and Fritz and the rest of his team, can be a huge part of helping our nation continue to achieve that outcome. So thank you very much for being here tonight and for what you've done for NDU.
And I'm a 1992 graduate. Mostly I drank beer and played softball while I was there. But I liked it. It was a good year, and I learned a lot. So I think that rounds out 3 experiences.
I'd like to, whoops. Thank you. That was really good. Thank you. Well, I want to thank the panel. I learned a lot this evening. A lot of headlines in that conversation. And we benefited from a lot of experience that they shared very freely this evening. I'd like to thank them also for their service and the service of their families, because nobody serves alone. And we've come to the end of what I think is a pretty remarkable evening. I'd like to thank the supporters of the National Defense University, the National Defense University Foundation, and I'd also express my personal thanks for being your MC and for having the privilege of moderating the panel this evening. Thank you.